everybody back. Okay. Welcome back from lunch. We're going to get started.
Can I just try out the microphone? Where do I stand, Debbie? Right here?
Yep. A, B, C, D. No.
A, B, C.
What do you got in that glass? Our
Little
online
gin.
people are going to think we're crazy. Okay. Okay, we're going to get started. I was just sort of.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. This afternoon's first session, we're going to be turning to campus design, environments and landscapes for learning. Our first presenter is Gretchen Pineo. Gretchen is an architectural historian at the Public Archaeology Lab in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where she specializes in architectural surveys and state-level and National Register documentation for a variety of public and private clients, including the National Park Service, the Massachusetts Historical Commission, and cities and towns throughout New England. She is a graduate of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, the Tufts University Museum Studies Program, and the Boston University Preservation Studies Program. And a little footnote to her bio, for those of you who are going on the trip tomorrow, Gretchen worked on preparing the updated National Register documentation for the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historical Site. So if you need a little bedtime reading, you might just want to brush up on that tomorrow morning. Robert McVaugh is a professor of art and art history at Colgate University. He's been there for over 40 years. Current research focuses on the evolution of the Colgate campus and the evolution of liberal arts college campuses in the post-World War II era. In 2018 to 2019, he mounted The Hill Envisioned, an exhibition of Colgate University's historical campus plans. In 2011, he published An Architect's Vision, Paul Rudolph and Colgate's Creative Arts Center, a catalog accompanying an exhibition of Rudolph's drawings found in the Colgate University archives. Please welcome Gretchen Pineo and Robert Vaughn, presenters for this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. So today I'm going to talk to you about the 4 of the 5 colleges in Western Massachusetts that are part of the 5-college system. An article in the Mount Holyoke Alumni Quarterly for winter 1988 states, like George Washington, who seemed to have slept in every 18th century home in the colonies, Frederick Law Olmsted, plus his son and associates, appears to have had a hand in the landscape design of just about every large estate, park, and campus during the last part of the 19th century and the early years of this century. I think as we've seen today, that is an accurate statement. In Western Massachusetts, there are 4 such campuses: Smith, Mount Holyoke, and Amherst colleges, and the University of Massachusetts Amherst, or UMass. All were founded in the 19th century as single-sex educational institutions. Smith and Mount Holyoke were and remain women's colleges, and UMass and Amherst were men's colleges but are now coeducational. Beyond their geographic proximity, Smith, Amherst, and Mount Holyoke shared early personnel in the form of professors from one college acting as trustees or chancellors or presidents for another, leading to intersections in architecture and landscape design between the campuses. The 3 colleges were all founded privately and based on a classical education regardless of the gender of student. The University of Massachusetts, founded under the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862, is an outlier in both campus design and curriculum. Today I'm going to briefly outline the early New England college architecture and then talk about the early landscape history of the 4 colleges. And then we'll see varying influences of the Olmsted firm on the campuses. When colleges were first organized in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and its neighboring colonies, the institutions reflected aspects of English colleges, such as Oxford and Cambridge. The English institutions typically consisted of interconnected buildings housing classrooms, dining, and sleeping spaces, and they had an enclosed quadrangle. Smaller institutions for men and women had classrooms, dining, and sleeping spaces housed in single buildings, and students might attend religious services in the surrounding town. Harvard and Yale, the earliest colleges established in New England, made use of some aspects of their English predecessors. The first buildings constructed at Yale, on the left, were arranged in a single row along the west edge of the campus, a form later known as the Yale Row. Harvard initially consisted of a single building which housed classrooms, dormitory spaces, and dining spaces, and students attended religious services with residents of the town. There was a third campus design as well, the cottage system, with Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. as its greatest champion. Olmsted promoted the idea that campuses should be like small New England villages, irregular and picturesque arrangements of buildings in a natural setting. His adoption of the college plan as the ideal for college campuses addressed his principal concerns when it came to campus planning: the need for an appropriate site plan with room for growth, the relationship of the campus to the community in which it was situated, and attention to the scale and design of buildings. The architectural design of the buildings situated within these mostly carefully created landscapes typically reflected popular styles at the time the buildings were constructed. The Greek Revival style, prevalent on the Amherst College campus, was popular during the early years of the 19th century with butted siding, sidelights, and low-pitched pediments and roof lines. Later in the 19th century, architectural choices were less formal as the picturesque aesthetic took hold of the architectural world, and Gothic Revival, Italianate, Second Empire French, and Queen Anne became popular. Even though architectural styles continued to evolve, encompassing the City Beautiful movement that was an outgrowth of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago and other Beaux-Arts concepts, these ideas did not come into play in the 19th century lives of our four colleges. Amherst College was founded as an extension of the Amherst Academy, which opened in 1814. While the Academy educated men and women, including Mary Lyon, who we will meet later, she was the future founder of Mount Holyoke College, Amherst College was created for the education of, quote, indigent young men with an eye toward the ministry. Described by Noah Webster as being on, quote, the hill in the center of the West Road in Amherst on which the church stands, and is within 2 miles of the geometrical center of the territory. Amherst College at its founding in 1821 was established in a single building called South College, but quickly expanded into a 3-building Yale Row, consisting of 3 Greek Revival-style buildings: North College, Johnson Chapel, and South College, arranged in a rigid line known as Chapel Row. South and North Colleges, which flanked Johnson Chapel, were dormitories, and Johnson Chapel contained the chapel sanctuary, instruction rooms, labs for scientific experiment, and the library. 2 Italianate-style buildings were added on to Chapel Row in the mid-19th century to make the layout a 5-building Yale Row. Williston Hall, standing on the site of the former Old North College, which burned down in 1857, and Appleton Cabinet. Other Italianate buildings near the former center of campus include Morgan Hall, built in 1852-53, and Woods Cabinet and Lawrence Observatory, called the Octagon, built in 1847-1848. The Octagon, which you can see on the left, one of the most recognizable buildings at Amherst College, was despised by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. When consulted about where to situate a chapel on campus, Olmsted suggested an entirely new plan for campus. At the time, most of the college buildings were oriented west toward the town common, and college officials thought that maybe they would like to build a new chapel near the Octagon, keeping that in the center. Olmsted, however, disliked the building and was concerned that any building that might replace it would seem to have been shoehorned in. Quote, in studying the structural plans of a college, he wrote, not the use of years, but centuries should be considered. Ultimately, Olmsted recommended that the new church be built in such a way as to reorient the campus center and subsequent buildings be arranged around that new center to create a quadrangle. The church in question was Stearns Church, built in 1870 and demolished in 1948. The gift of William F. Stearns, who was the son of a president of Amherst College, the Monson Granite Church was, following Olmsted's suggestion, built east of South College. Despite retaining Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. as a consultant when siting new buildings, students and alumni felt as though the campus lacked an overarching design. In 1903, members of the class of 1893 decided to take campus landscape design matters into their own hands and hired a team of prominent artists and architects to design a plan. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., Charles McKim, and Amherst graduate William Mead, both of McKim, Mead, and White, Daniel Burnham, the head architect of the Chicago World's Fair, and renowned sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens. Olmsted and Mead did most of the work, designing a plan that would reorient campus around a center green, much like the one Olmsted's father had suggested in 1870. However, the elder Olmsted disliked Chapel Row, finding it uninteresting, while Mead and the younger Olmsted opined, quote, "The group and its setting so perfectly express the early traditions of the college and are withal so charming in consistency of character that they must be accepted and preserved as essential features of any project of future development." The plan designed by Mead and Olmsted emphasized the main plateau of the campus as a central design feature as opposed to the Amherst Common to the west. Recognizing that there were already significant buildings to act as a boundary for the campus green, Mead and Olmsted turned their attention to the buildings themselves instead of the grounds. The three original buildings of Chapel Row were felt to be so worthy of saving, but the committee was not as kind to the outer two buildings, Williston Hall and Appleton Cabinet. Not only did they detract from the unity of the campus plateau, Mead and Olmsted described them as, quote, "crude, ill-designed, and poorly built structures of an unfortunate period in American architecture." The duo also recommended giving Johnson Chapel a second front to face the new quadrangle, removing the octagon and woods cabinet to open the view from the president's house, and keeping the east and south slopes of the college open. In the closing of their report to the Board of Trustees, Mead and Olmsted warned that, quote, "While any plan for the future of a college must be flexible to meet unforeseen conditions, yet unless there be some plan, the essential points of which are unflinchingly adhered to, the ultimate result of meeting each temporary problem as it arises must in the long run lead to a confused, inconvenient, and extravagant result." Ultimately, Amherst College ignored most of Mead and Olmsted's specific ideas while maintaining the general sense of the plan. And so this is the Amherst quadrangle. Contrasting with Amherst Yale Row was the seminary building constructed for Mount Holyoke College in South Hadley, which is just to the south of Amherst. Mount Holyoke College was founded in 1837 as a women's seminary by Mary Lyon, a graduate of Amherst Academy. At the time of Mount Holyoke's founding, men's colleges, like Amherst, consisted of separate buildings designed to give the men a measure of independence as they moved from one to the other. Conversely, while women's colleges were created to encourage independent thought and action among women, social mores dictated that an independent woman was less feminine. Despite having members of the Amherst College faculty on the Board of Trustees for Mount Holyoke Seminary, as it was known at its founding, Mary Lyon designed her school to be contained in one building under the idea that the virtue of women would be guarded with internal order following external order. That is, if your surroundings are calm and peaceful, you too will be calm and peaceful. The seminary building was a 4-story red brick building with white trim built following a generalized house plan. Initially, the building looked like any other in the town of South Hadley and could have been mistaken for a factory or an inn as easily as a college. Shortly after its construction, a 2-story white piazza was added to the facade, giving it a distinctly domestic look, hinting externally at the house plan that lay within. As the seminary grew, so did the seminary building. While other campuses might have added buildings to accommodate the growing campus population, Mount Holyoke chose to add wings onto the original building. Despite the growing size of the college, Seminary Hall maintained its domestic structure and centrality to campus life until tragedy struck on the night of September 27, 1896. While the students and faculty residing in the building were evacuated safely, the entire building was consumed by the conflagration, forcing Mount Holyoke to rebuild the campus. A decision had to be made following the 1896 fire. Either rebuild exactly as it had been before, or adopt the popular cottage plan that was in use at Smith College, as we shall see shortly. William C. Brocklesby, a Connecticut architect, had already been engaged by the seminary to design a cottage at the behest of Elizabeth Storrs Mead, then president of the school. As the fire struck before Brocklesby's plan could be enacted, the opportunity to rebuild the campus integrating the influence of Smith College was at hand. Lyman Williston, trustee of Mount Holyoke at the time of the fire, was also a Smith College trustee and placed a call to John Charles Olmsted, Frederick Law Olmsted Sr.'s nephew and adopted son and partner in the firm, inviting him to visit the campus. As we'll see later, the plan developed by the Olmsteds was similar to that of Smith, with small cottages housing the students and separate buildings for different subjects arranged around a green space with meandering paths. Beyond the adoption of the cottage plan made popular by Smith, Mount Holyoke shared architects as well. Peabody and Stearns of Boston designed Williston Hall, a smaller, less ornate version of Smith's College Hall, and you can see both here. Brocklesby designed the gym and 2 of the new cottages. Mount Holyoke, unlike Amherst College, did not have a unifying style of architecture. Instead, unity of design came from the materials used in the construction: brick and local stone from Longmeadow and Monson. Buildings constructed just after the turn of the century were designed by architects trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, like George F. Newton, and the firm of Putnam and Cox, each with more elaborate Gothic or Jacobean detailing to practically shout the dignity of the college to the surrounding town. Employing Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. to assist in the placement of buildings around the campus, the site selection formed 2 informally separate areas, one for academic buildings and one for residences. Aware of the crowding of cottages that had taken place at Smith prior to a comprehensive campus design, Lyman Williston was adamant that the buildings be situated around quadrangles, creating enclosed park-like spaces for the enjoyment of students and faculty alike. This new design, along with the recently adopted 4-year academic program and changed in name from Mount Holyoke Seminary to Mount Holyoke College, would project to the world that the college had come of age. Smith College, the last of the 4 to be established, is an architectural intermediary between Amherst and Mount Holyoke. The executors of local resident Sophia Smith's estate, which provided money for the founding of a women's college in Northampton, counted among their numbers Amherst College professors and trustees. The Amherst College influence can be seen in the use of separate buildings for separate activities, which broke with the tradition of earlier women's colleges, including Vassar, Wellesley, and Mount Holyoke, which housed all campus operations in one building. John Morton Green, Sophia Smith's pastor in Hatfield, was instrumental in the adoption of the cottage plan by Smith College. Married to a Mount Holyoke graduate, Green was familiar with the South Hadley campus design and felt that sequestering the women away in a seminary setting kept them out of touch with the real world. Green advocated housing students in several small buildings or cottages to bring them into the social life of the town, and convinced Sophia Smith to choose Northampton as the site of the college rather than her hometown of Hatfield. The initial setting for Smith was on 2 adjacent farmsteads purchased by the trustees for the purposes of developing a campus. As described by Helen Horowitz, quote, Smith College's initial campus had every element important to the new vision: the dignified setting for intellectual life, the male patriarchal presence, the domestic dwelling house, placement on a central street, and no library or chapel. The placement of the campus on a central street did more than just add ease of access to the campus. It integrated the campus into the life of the town and the town into the life of the campus. This was a fundamental difference between Smith and Mount Holyoke. Mount Holyoke was situated on one side of a college street, maintaining a pastoral tone with expansive green spaces and a lake, while Smith straddled both sides of the main street in Northampton, taking on the feel of a small town itself. The early Smith campus architecture is more eclectic than its Victorian Gothic beginnings. Buildings were a combination of those that were already on or moved to the site and those that were purpose-built. Dewey House, now called Dewey Hall, originally the residence of a prominent Northampton family, was designed by Thomas Pratt in the style of Ithiel Town, with classicizing elements in the form of 4 Ionic columns adorning a 2-story square house. The choice of Dewey House for the first residence of Smith served 2 purposes. First, it had been a single-family house and thus fitted into the college design envisioned for the campus residences. And second, it could be used as a template for cottages to be constructed in the future. The first purpose-built building at the college was College Hall, designed by Peabody and Stearns. It was placed on a hill overlooking Northampton on one side and the campus on the other. Clearly influenced by the Natural History Museum at Oxford, College Hall employs polychromy and local fauna created out of terracotta as details around doors and atop pillars. In 1892, Smith College hired Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. to design a landscape plan for the campus. So I think we're seeing a pattern. Start building stuff and then call the Olmsteds. Olmsted's design incorporated winding paths to connect residential houses to each other and an eschewed formal axes and rigid geometry. This park-like design, which featured irregularly shaped lawns surrounded by trees, allowed the campus to grow organically like a small agrarian village. Described by Richard Dober in Campus Landscapes as a collegiate version of the metropolitan Boston park system, the Smith campus was an ensemble of ponds, groves of trees, and patches of ground cover surrounding specimen trees. This landscape design took into account the natural topography of the campus, as well as the educational goals behind the idea of transforming the campus into a botanic garden. Paradise Pond, one of the more well-known landscape features of the site, was added in the early part of the 20th century when Smith acquired the grounds of the Massachusetts State Hospital, which was adjacent to the original Smith campus. Originally the site of a stocking factory and a laundry, among other light industrial uses, Paradise Pond became the location of the new home for the president of the college, representing a shift in the center of campus. Designed by John Nolan, a Cambridge city planner and landscape architect educated at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the additional campus acreage would maintain some of Olmsted's original plan while adapting the campus to the 20th century needs of its students. The outlier among these four colleges is the Massachusetts Agricultural College, called MAC, now the University of Massachusetts Amherst, or UMass. Founded under the auspices of the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862, the MAC was a public institution designed to educate young men in horticulture, animal husbandry, botany, and other aspects of agriculture. The trustees of the college initially hired Calvert Vaux and Joseph R. Richards to design the principal building and surrounded landscape for the campus. Richards designed a 4-story stone building with a mansard roof, which Vaux proposed should be constructed along the east ridge of campus. The argument for placement presented by Calvert Vaux and Joseph Richards in their report to the trustees of the nascent college made sense aesthetically and agriculturally. The Central Plateau offered the best farmland and thus should be left open so that not only would the land be sufficient for agricultural studies of the incoming students, but that it should appear to be ample as well. Chiding the trustees for putting their desires ahead of the best use of the campus for the students, Vaux wrote, quote, "In regard to the location of the college building proper, with its probable accessories, it is to be borne in mind that the representative owner or occupier of the whole establishment is to be the student for the time being, not the president or any officer." Vaux also questioned the placement of the main building in the middle of the campus plateau, urging trustees to consider the future expansion needs of the college. Predictably, the trustees ignored Vaux's recommendation, deciding instead to place the building roughly in the center of the property. They then engaged Vaux's former partner, Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., to lay out a driveway to the building leading from the main road of Amherst. Olmsted questioned the placement and design of the building and echoed Vaux's concerns about the plan. Olmsted advocated for an informal group of buildings around a green that would also serve as the Morrill Act-mandated drill ground of the academic functions divided among 4 smaller buildings and cottages for housing no more than 30 students, each situated along the road and the common, leaving the wide-open plain available for agriculture, the founding purpose of the college. He also recommended damming Tan Brook, which ran through the east part of the campus, to create a pond. Consisting of 310 acres at its founding, Olmsted saw no reason to build a massive building as might be found in a city with limited space for outward expansion. In a letter to Daniel Waldo Lincoln, then a member of the Board of Trustees, Olmsted wrote, quote, "The individuality of an agricultural college lies in its agriculture, not in its building, which is a mere piece of apparel to be fitted to the requirements of the agricultural trunk. The building and the building site, therefore, must be the corollary of a plan, and it would be more than a mistake, in my judgment, to make it the ruling circumstance." Annoyed at receiving a lecture instead of a plan, the trustees rejected Olmsted's plan and passed a resolution making their collective opinion plain, stating that, quote, "There was nothing in the report of Mr. Olmsted to warrant the trustees in undoing or changing the action taken in regard to the general location of the collegiate buildings." Olmsted countered with an article published in The Nation in October 1866 titled, "How Not to Establish an Agricultural College," in which he described the folly of the plan of the Massachusetts trustees, likely concurrently dashing any hope held by the college president, Henry French, that the trustees might reconsider their rejection of Olmsted. The result of the ensuing turmoil between Vaux, Olmsted, French, and the building committee was French's resignation and Vaux and Olmsted being dropped from consideration for consulting on other buildings. When the MAC opened to students in 1867, the first buildings were the main building, which no longer exists, and North and South colleges. Neither of those buildings remain extant either. Among the remaining early buildings are the Old Chapel, the Stockbridge House, the East and West Experiment Stations, and the rebuilt South College construction after an 1886 fire. The experiment stations were built as part of the 1887 Hatch Act, which authorized the creation of agricultural experiment stations on land grant campuses established under the Morrill Land Grant Act to conduct research beneficial to farmers in improving their crops. The West Experiment Station, built in 1883, is red brick and sandstone and housed the chemistry lab of the State Experiment Station. Near the center of campus, two campus landmarks were constructed in the late 19th century. First, the iconic Richardsonian Romanesque Old Chapel, designed by Stephen Earle, was built in 1886. Constructed of local Pelham granite with red Longmeadow sandstone trim, the chapel served as a library, a natural history museum, and the religious center of the college. The campus pond was created in the winter of 1890 to 91, following Olmsted's recommendation of damming the Tan Brook, adding to the pastoral image of the campus. The original informal arrangement of the campus, due to lack of an overarching plan, is evident in later views of the campus. In 1911, Frank Waugh, the founder of the college's landscape architecture program in 1903, made a study of the campus landscape for the Commission on Grounds, noting early contributions by Vaux and Olmsted and somewhat lamenting the rejection of the Olmsted campus design. In his report prepared for the building committee, Waugh gave his audience a rough history of the campus plan as it existed to date, as well as expounding upon the Olmsted plan for the campus. Waugh validated Olmsted's design, stating, quote, "The discussion of the purposes of the college, of its policies and its probable future, strikingly reveal Olmsted's insight and breadth of view. It seems quite clear that he had a juster comprehension of the destinies of the infant institution and of wise means for furthering them than most of the honored gentlemen and founders of the college with whom he worked." In time, the landscape designs of the four colleges reached far beyond the Pioneer Valley. Smith and Mount Holyoke influenced each other, as well as established women's colleges in Massachusetts, such as Wellesley and Radcliffe, Bryn Mawr in Pennsylvania, and Scripps College in California. The rejected plan for the MAC was modified and presented to the trustees of the Maine Agricultural College, later the University of Maine at Orono, where it had a somewhat better reception, but still not fully implemented. Ultimately, the modern campuses of each of the four colleges are the true test of the effectiveness of early campus planning endeavors and reflect the continuing influence of the Olmsteds. Thank you.
The last 2 days have been a real pleasure for me. I've learned so much about Olmsteds outside of the narrow, relatively, I now discover, very narrow focus of campus planning. And I hope I'll be able to integrate that as I continue to work on the campus and other campuses. You've really enriched my familiarity with the firm's work. But it is worth noting that Blake Gumbrick, a prominent geographer, has astutely observed that a campus can and does serve many of the community roles of a public park. It's not always, but it is always also inflected by the more targeted aspirational goals of the particular institution. And it's the latter that I hope to bring into sharpest focus today. I've been at Colgate for over 40 years. I should also probably, as just an admission, part of my interest in the campus, shall we say, was augmented for a period when I was the mayor of the village of Hamilton, and the behavioral kind of interactions that are fueled or inhibited by campus design becomes a major issue when you're the mayor of a small community with an overwhelming student body. But I've been at Colgate for 40 years, and I really never tire of listening to tour guides as they ferry groups around the campus. The amount of false but really appealing information that they regularly share about buildings and grounds is fascinating. My favorite tour guide myth for Colgate is the oft-repeated but specious claim that Paul Rudolph designed Colgate's Dana Creative Arts Center to look like a piano. But I also know that I can count on them to always mention that Colgate was designed by Olmsted, a phrase which is normally followed by the designer of Central Park, though I do recall once hearing the connection made to the Fens instead, and just assumed I was hearing a Boston Red Sox fan. If asked what Olmsted did at Colgate, I'm not sure the tour guide would know what to say. But they'd gracefully tap dance, as tour guides always do, because within the Colgate community, the Olmsted connection is often cited, but actually little understood. And so I've worked to piece together what I can about his visit of 1883 and assess its impacts over the last few years. And I would like to cite, we have a new archivist at Colgate who's come in the last 10 years, and it's really through her work that this became possible, given the state of the archives prior to that. And I'd like to share some of that work with you today. I'm assuming that most of you have heard of Colgate, but have not visited, probably visiting the other C University in upstate New York rather than stopping in Hamilton. So let's start by familiarizing ourselves, as Olmsted would, with the place and the land that we're focused on. Not as Olmsted encountered it, that'll come later. What I'd like to introduce is the campus as you might encounter it today in the 21st century. The historic core of the campus occupies the northern slopes of a long line of hills that extend to the south, which is the top side of the aerial view as you have it here. The hill, as the core of the academic and residential quads is called, is actually a hillside terrace or table that interrupts the slope of that long line of hills as it cascades down to lowlands around Payne Creek, which you can now see it in it was dammed in the beginning of the 20th century to create Taylor Lake, which is one of our most beloved campus landmarks. But in Olmsted's time, that lake did not exist. The historic campus is bound by 3 public roads, Hamilton, Broad, and Kendrick. But more important to our story, it is crossed, I hope as you can see in the center, by College Street, one of the earliest village roads, and that started or intersected Broad on the west and then slid obliquely to the east-southeast until it crested the low saddle on the east side of the hill. Other notable landmarks that we'll come back to is Oak Drive, the vehicular entrance from the north, which in this case is the lower part of the image, Willow Path, the major pedestrian path from the north, Whitnall Field, a multi-purpose expanse on the west side, and the so-called Cardiac Hill, or sometimes called College Hill Walk, and that's the historic pedestrian path up the slopes, and you can see it in the view below as it passes by the library, slides up through Person Hall. These are all recent buildings, and then goes up to the chapel. These elements interact within a dramatic topography. As you can see, the hill is 130 feet above the plain. Land falls off precipitously from the hill to the north and the west, but more gently to the east. The problem, however, was that the land to the east was in private hands until well into the 20th century. So all early development on the campus and in Olmsted's time was constrained to the more difficult land to the west and directly to the north. And here I show you that one of the earliest photographs we have of the campus, and you can see again that so-called cardiac hill or hill path snaking its way up on the right-hand side in the middle ground of the photograph. For much of the last 150 years, Colgate students have trudged day in and day out up and down, what is in effect a 10-story climb in the space of about 2 football fields. So it's healthy, shall we say, and it's also largely avoided by the current population that would prefer to take the bus. Okay, so now let's try to take ourselves back to the 19th century grounds that Olmsted encountered, and part of this will be a discussion of the attitudes that shaped those grounds and their operation. Origin myths are always potent, and Colgates are worth considering for a moment. At Colgate, we speak, even today, of 13 men, $13, and 13 prayers as the reflection of our origins when they set up the Baptist Educational Society of the state of New York, which was the founding institution. Just to avoid confusion, I'll sometimes speak of Madison University. That was the name of the institution from 1846 to 1890, when it became Colgate University. And prior to 1846, it actually didn't have a name. It just went by seminary or institution. I don't really want to get mired in the details, but the 13 men, $13, and 13 prayers expression focuses our attention on the roots of the institution in faith and in voluntary contributions linked to that faith. It was founded to educate Baptist ministers, the first institution west of the Hudson to do so. For decades, the school operated and grew in a hand-to-mouth fashion based on contributions from Baptists and Baptist meetings across the Mid-Atlantic region. That it prospered in this out-of-the-way rural setting became bound up in a presumption of its as the locus of a special divine sanction or blessing. And this is extremely important to the understanding that the institution had of itself through much of the 19th century. Confidence in God's special blessing and oversight, and the oversight of its institution and its grounds, was dramatically reinforced for many of the campus traditionalists by what's known as the removal controversy of 1847 to 50. In 1847, a very powerful cohort within the board initiated a campaign to move the school from Hamilton to the burgeoning city of Rochester. Actually, by all practical considerations, pretty smart thing to have done at the time. 3 years of intense, not to say vicious, debate ensued, with the Rochester faction apparently victorious, until an 11th hour perpetual injunction based on a legal technicality ruled that the school must stay in Hamilton forever. And I think you can see how that would, for the generation, the traditionalists, those that were enduring, confirm this idea that there was a special divine oversight of this particular place in connection with the institution. A fellow, P.B. Spear, had been a key player in the miraculous defense of Hamilton. He was also the treasurer and by 1883, no longer teaching. The president in 1883, Ebenezer Dodge, had first arrived at the school in 1853 when memories of that miraculous victory were very fresh. They and many alumni of the era manifested a faith in the divinely sanctioned or blessed natural state of the campus. And this is we can imagine as we're moving into a campus planning issue, that becomes a challenge in a sense. They really felt the divinely blessed natural conditions in their marrow and felt that changing approach might signal a betrayal of the university's core commitment to the training of missionaries and ministers. On the other hand, several of the younger faculty, including a fellow James M. Taylor, who we'll hear more about, advocated strongly for campus improvements, and they appeared to have a sympathetic ear in James B. Colgate, who was the dominant figure on the board. This ongoing disagreement in the administration and faculty confused the university really management of its campus through much of the 1860s and 1870s. It was highly, highly contested. Prior to 1870, there were actually very few reasons for the students to leave the Hill. The three main buildings were up there in proximity. The boarding hall, which you can see in the map. It's on the road which wraps the southern side of the campus, and the boarding hall is down there by Broad Street. The boarding hall met all post office and dining needs. The main road ran on the south side rather than the village side. And so really until about 1870, the experience of this campus was insular. It was on the hill. Very much so. But then two things happened. First, James B. Colgate oversaw the purchase of several parcels of land north of College Street and across Payne Creek in 1871 and 72. And on the map, which is an 1875 map, you can see up toward the center, above the line of the creek, something which says Colgate Academy. So that was a new building which he had built there, and he had secured the parcels of land along the creek, many of them, not all of them, but many of them, to support that new function. And the academes, the preparatory students, studied there, and there was the administration there, but they continued to live on the hill. In the photograph here, you can see the academy, which is that Second Empire structure, actually in brick, one of the few brick structures at the institution for much of the 19th and early 20th century in the cleaned up fields. Okay. The second development was that the university abandoned its boarding responsibilities. This may not seem particularly interesting, but prior to that, the university had insisted all students must eat together. This was absolutely critical to the culture of the institution, and they ate south of Broad Street. They ate in the traditional campus. Then student opposition was so strong in the 1860s, or it was very strong, that eventually in 1868 they began to bend the rules occasionally, and once it opened, the students started to find all sorts of reasons to live off campus, or I'm sorry, to board off campus, until finally in 1874 they closed the boarding house, one of the absolutely unifying structures for the previous 50 years. And students, they didn't make it available. They said, now you have to eat downtown. Well, they didn't say that, but that was the fact of what happened. So from being a very insular campus, basically rooted on one side of the hill, it became an institution that flowed really inchoately into the village, where many of the people in the village took advantage of the revenue that they could generate through boarding opportunities. Still, they didn't resolve it. The various factions struggled with these changes, couldn't make sense of them. The traditionalists, for example, this is one of the most remarkable of things. The students had built a bathhouse back in the 1840s where they could bathe under the water from one of the springs in the upper hill. Some exuberant students in their freshman celebration ended up burning the bathhouse at the end of their first year. And for the next 8 years, the students said, you need to repair the bathhouse. And the administration said, it's not our bathhouse, it's your bathhouse. This was the state of kind of confusion in terms of the organization of the campus. And it continued. But then in 1882, we had a diphtheria outbreak, and 2 students died in one of the dorms. The State Board of Health came in and alerted the university to the weakness of its infrastructure. So finally, the threshold was passed, and there was agreement that they needed some serious planning. And here we have Albert Bickmore, who was a professor at Colgate, a board member, and at Madison, and a board member, and then also at the American Museum of Natural History. He knew Olmsted, so he invited Olmsted and said, please come and give us a supreme plan for the grounds. Olmsted agreed, but then no date was set until finally in October of 1883, James B. Colgate waded in and applied, I suspect, well, he was an extraordinarily wealthy figure in New York, and Olmsted probably decided it was a good time to come. But he changed the task. It was now locate 2 buildings whose construction is imminent. No statement about a comprehensive plan. So something happened, which we'll try to get to in a bit. Colgate also, strangely in the note, said, I want this to be a quiet visit. And in particular, don't let P.B. Spear know that you're coming. So we can see how the continued tensions within the institution may have affected things. Olmsted came on 18th October, and regrettably, we have very little about the aspects of that visit. We know he began drafting the report almost immediately, and we know that a copy must have been received by the end of the year. But we don't have the report. We only have the notes, which are in the Library of Congress, and the sketch plan, which I will soon show you, but which I also opened the meeting with, which is in Brookline. And so, in a sense, what I've been working on is trying to assemble from those materials what that report must have carried. Olmsted, as we can imagine, was confidently blunt in his assessment of the grounds. He acknowledged that it was a commanding site, but he also noted the absence of, quote, any noticeable architectural significance, suggested that any of the buildings were as likely taken, quote, for a factory, a warehouse, a barrack, a hospital, or a poorhouse as for a seat of learning. Moreover, he noted that the spacing between them, and let me see if I can get, oops, I'm not getting, yeah, this is going to be, he noted that the spacing between them caused them to be perceived, quote, more as a series of independent edifices than as a group cooperative to a central purpose. He found that the grounds were raw, weak, oblique, wild, but perfectly prosaic. And the pastures in the upper hill were inhospitable. The plantings on the northern slopes were, quote, wholly discordant with the modeling of the surface and the disposition of natural growth. He then recommended a move to create the two buildings which might address some of these shortcomings. And they're really rather ingenious. As I say, there were 2 structures, a library and a laboratory museum. And the first, and what he proposed, was that they be seen as a common unit linked by a massive stone parapet positioned between 100 or closer to 200 feet downslope from the existing buildings. The buildings themselves were located, as you can see, opposite the spaces between the existing buildings. And he was very explicit that what he thought the university should do would be to give these new buildings a architectural distinction by means of towers, porches, and grand elements which the early buildings lacked. And that as one approached, one would see them fill those gaps, create a comprehensive unit, and then that unit would then dissolve instead of being a massive structure, which he tended to oppose in college campuses, and you would have a more informal clustering of structures up on the slopes. So the, let's see, he also proposed a new carriageway, which you can see in the map. It's the curving road on the left-hand side, and you can see that it sweeps over the section of the campus with a lower grade, but it also positions the visitor such that this optical phenomenon of integration and separation was perfectly positioned as one looked up the hill. So what he was doing is addressing that problem that he saw that there was no architectural distinction within the campus by means of this approaching road. He also reinforced interest in the walk so that there's a separation of pedestrian and vehicular. And then but then the last thing and the most remarkable thing that he did was he said, get rid of College Street. Take a historic road running through the campus and get rid of it. And this is the idea of architectural distinction and the elimination of that road, which isolated the southern from the northern sections, are the two great contributions that he made to the campus. He was the one that opened the door to seeing the campus as a hill and a plain, which should be negotiated with respect to that topography. And while we still have College Street, there's no administration with the courage to get rid of it. He did help us to reconceive the campus in a far more gracious manner than was the institution that he visited in 1883. Okay, so that's at least what I have that I can fit in the time slot.
That's the genius of the place.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Well, thank you both, Gretchen and Robert, for that and taking us to a different property type with where we see Olmsted's deft handling and ingenious, as I think Robert described, in pulling the Colgate campus together. So, questions from the audience? Yes. Oh, just a minute.
The two buildings that that Olmsted proposed, were they built?
No, and that's been one of the impediments of people understanding the Olmsted. You actually look at the next 10 years and nothing that he suggested happened. And that's not uncharacteristic of campus plans. If many of you have been involved in them, they almost are never realized. But what they do is they plant seeds. And I think what we have to honor with Olmsted here is not, we can investigate why it didn't happen, and I have a number of surmises there, but more importantly, did notions get planted that would come forward as administrations changed, as a sense of the place and the possibilities of the place changed? That, I think, is the real value of the campus plan. Is what?
Continue. You did it. What happened?
Oh, well, what happened was James B. Colgate desperately wanted to buy the property that P.B. Spear owned on campus. Another long story, but and he, I believe, was actually hoping that Olmsted would come in and say, this is the right place for the library, P.B. Spear, you should sell to the university. And P.B. Spear did not. He held out, but so did Colgate. Colgate basically for the next 3 or 4 years kept the word out that I want to build my library on the P.B. Spear Plateau. Finally lost, and it was relocated in 1890 into a much less desirable place. So that's why it didn't, Colgate was pushing a lot of this, but then he didn't get what he wanted, so he probably didn't put his shoulder to the wheel in trying to get the plan fully realized. That's my guess.
Yes, as a Rochester native, I was glad to hear that Rochester mentioned. We have an old joke in Rochester. There's always a Rochester connection to everything. So thank you for confirming that bias. But one of the first projects I worked on, like 3 decades ago, was a heritage corridor along one of New York's old lateral canals that were built to connect to the Erie Canal, and that was the Genesee Valley Canal. But in doing that project, I had to learn about the whole state canal system and the lateral canals. And I could swear that there was a canal that went through Hamilton, I believe the Chemung Canal, or probably maybe the Shenango Canal.
Shenango Canal.
The
right.
Shenango Canal. And I thought I detected a footprint of that on one of your images. And I'm wondering if, you know, it was probably in existence, like, up until maybe the late 1870s. And so I'm wondering if Olmsted tried to do anything with regard to that canal in the campus planning or even acknowledged it.
Not that I know of. By 1870, the Shenango Canal was largely filled in and disgusting. It was short-lived. But the train came to town in 1868. So it was actually the 70s and 80s were a time of a lot of change within the village as well, because the train was much more effective in linking it to the outside world much faster than was the Shenango Canal. As far as I know, there's nothing in his notes about the canal and its potential, and the university did not own any land contiguous with it, so it wouldn't have had a direct impact that I can see. That's the best I can tell you.
This is a question from the virtual audience from Lori Matthews. She loves the cottage plan and wonders if either of the presenters have any thoughts on why that didn't become more of a prevalent thing in a campus planning.
That's a great question. I think this is my own 2 cents on it. I think some of it is it's harder to get a building that somebody wants to pay to have put up. People like to have their names on buildings. They like to sponsor buildings. And a dorm is not the coolest building to have your name on. So my sense is in trying to have small, compact campuses and control over your students, you want them sort of centralized, and also it's just harder to get those funded.
I think that those observations make a lot of sense, but I think there's another factor that we're forgetting. The cottage system became virtually prevalent in many of these colleges as the fraternity system. The cottage system really was absolutely embraced at the turn of the 20th century by at least college planners. I'm not as alert to the way they operated in large university settings where they, I think, were more of a ghetto. But for example, Colgate built no residential facilities between 1834 and 1922 but in that space, there were about well over a dozen fraternities which assumed the overwhelming responsibility for housing. So indeed, the cottage system is alive and well on many, many college campuses in the fraternity row or enclave.
Hi, I've got a question for Gretchen. Of your 4 campuses, maybe which one or ones most still kind of maybe embody some principles from Olmsted? One thing you didn't say, you kind of said the original plan, but was the Olmsted firm later on at all involved in planning, subsequent consulting into these campuses? So you could go to see one of these campuses and maybe see an element of Olmsted planning?
That's a great question, Jim, and I was hoping somebody was going to ask me that. So the colleges, so Smith, Amherst, and Mount Holyoke all still possess a great deal of Olmsted landscape, the paths, the quads. UMass, on the other hand, and I'm a UMass grad, so I don't want to say biased because I don't think that's it, only has a very tiny bit of what was an Olmsted plan. So Frank Waugh in 1911 sort of did the best that he could to resurrect what the Olmsted plan would have looked like. And so there's small parts of it. So we have the campus pond, and then in front of the student union, there's a little loop. It's called Ellis Oval, and it was the only remaining part of the Olmsted Road, and that's all that's left on campus. But I should say the dormitory system at UMass is effectively the college system. There's, I think we're up to 7 housing areas now, but they're all little insular little things with their own little quad. So they sort of used the cottage system idea, and they're all up on the hill. So eventually they took Olmsted's advice for where the dorms should be, but as the university moved away from being strictly agricultural, now the plain is wholly built up with buildings.
I have another question for Gretchen. As we talk about campus master planning and development pressures on universities, new infrastructure, are there existing campus master plans or cultural landscape plans or reports that identify and document, these important landscapes so that they're preserved and protected?
When I first started working on this, I was not aware of one at UMass. There's a big push towards that as more buildings were being constructed, and there was a recognition of the elements that were Olmsted. And so there's a lot of, hold on, wait a minute, let's not let that building fall down or that building get taken down to do something. And so in the 60s, there was a master plan done. And if you go to UMass, you'll see the elements of brutalist architecture pretty much everywhere. And so that was sort of the guiding principle for a while. And now that there's more recognition of the older buildings. And so one of the experiment stations, they needed to expand the physics department, and they were going to take it down, but instead they moved it literally brick by brick, and now it has HVAC, and everybody's very excited, and it's physics department offices now. And so it's still keeping use.
You still have 4 minutes and 48 seconds. So I have a question. These campuses were designed with very specific educational goals. Training Baptist ministers, who sound like very bad boys, by the way, women. Mount Holyoke took the single seminary building style, Smith integrating into the community, Amherst, again, another training boys for the ministry, young men for the ministry, and UMass, agriculture, farming, progressive farming, yeoman farming, whatever. How do you, I guess I asked this question because I'm not a design professional. I'm asking it as a design historian. How do you think those students experienced the design elements as an extension of communicating the educational methods and purposes of these campuses? And does any of that, certainly the goals have changed, but does any of that campus layout reflect educational policies, methods, goals today in these campuses? So both of you.
You want to rock, paper, scissors for it? So for your question, Betsy, I can really only mostly talk more about UMass because I was there. I spent 4 years there, a couple years post-grad. Some of the campus buildings, you can still tell that the original intent was an agricultural school, and so there are spaces that remind you that that's the origin of the school. For Smith and Mount Holyoke and Amherst, I spent limited time on those campuses, but they do sort of retain the quad feel, so it feels like an insular college community, even with them being in the center of Amherst and the center of Northampton and the center of South Hadley. They are still not walled off because you can walk through campus and campus flows into town, but they're still sort of very cohesive. This is a college campus, and UMass is less cohesive in design. It's more of a textbook of architectural styles, and it has become a city unto itself. It is so large, but you can still find nuggets of things that you go, yep, this was Mass Ag, the Stockbridge Barn, things like that. So it's all still sort of there, and you can feel pieces of how the students would have experienced life on campus.
I can actually, I can mention two things, one from all the way back in the 1830s and another one for this year. First of all, there are many records of the students when they were living at what was then the seminary, where they wrote to their parents, and they were very, very profoundly aware that the positioning of the buildings on the hill up above the valley, looking to the northwest, which was the frontier at this point, reinforced the notion of their missionary mission. And they also connected that to a sense of nature as a space in which they could be educated in a spiritually superior way to a city environment. So that was very clear in terms of their goals and the spaces of the early campus. This year, I'm teaching a course in campus architecture, and the challenge to the students is looking in the history of the Colgate campus, identify characteristics of the campus that shape your own education, and look in the genealogy of the spaces as to when did they arise, how did they arise, and often they arose for reasons very different from their contemporary causes. What the students are most alert to is what we would call the siloing of disciplines, and therefore the segregation by discipline within the campuses. They're acutely aware that there's a STEM campus, and there's a humanities campus, and there's a social science campus. They're also acutely aware of how some of the issues I mentioned about residential sprawl, dispersal, lack of management for roughly 50 years at the institution have led to what they see as a bifurcation between introductory students, their first year, who live on the campus, and then going off the hill, which I've read all sorts of campus planning about how wonderful that is to support the maturation of students, and I hear nothing but outrage from the students of this sense of absolute isolation of the various constituencies within the campuses, particularly as we push to a greater sense of integration and recognition of diversity in the campus population. It's going to be a major problem in campuses like Colgate as we spread them out, and now we're trying to say, let's get you back into a community, and every day the campus fights them. Every day. And they're absolutely aware of it. Sorry, that's got a little editorial.
Well, thank you, Gretchen, and thank you, Robert. I found it very exciting and enlightening. So I turn it over to Debbie to tell us what we all do next.
Okay, I think we have break time till 3:15, and there's new break food if you're hungry, and there's new coffee. So.